Joining me now to discuss these latest developments is One America's political correspondent, Jack Posobiec, from our bureau in the nation's capital. Jack, you're actually one of the few people that I've seen consistently following this situation regarding the coronavirus in China. At first, you were kind of posting a lot of videos, a lot of the scenes that were coming out of China, and that's something that, surprisingly, I haven't seen from a lot of other networks. So what is your response so far from the images that we've seen coming out of China?
Yeah, well, Alex, I've spent a lot of time in China, both when I worked for the American Chamber of Commerce over there, as well as focused on China when I was working in U.S. Navy intelligence. I'm a Mandarin speaker myself, and so I understand how a disease outbreak like this plays into the Chinese Communist Party and in terms of their regime outlook. They believe in China in this thing called the theory of dynastic cycles, and that means that each cycle has, or each dynasty has a cycle that eventually leads it to a specific end point, and all of that goes in favor with the mandate of heaven. This is an idea that the mandate of heaven has shined down and has placed upon a new dynasty this sort of right to rule sort of thing. So they view pestilence or disease outbreaks as something very underlying. This goes back 5,000 years of unbroken Chinese history that they believe in, that it could potentially be something they could view as undermining the regime. And it's very interesting that you heard a lot of top Chinese officials refer to this disease or this virus as Satan, as sent from Satan. You've heard that almost to what, more Western ears might sound biblically sounding, but actually to them it has a far different meaning. They're positioning it as sent from something that's evil, and then of course the good Chinese party, the current communist regime, is therefore setting up to fight against it.
And I think that's an interesting point, because everything that I've heard is that anything that comes out of mainland China right now should be taken with a grain of salt and almost should be kind of considered to be worse than it actually is. I mean, we're seeing the numbers coming out of China right now, but to your point a little bit, there is a little bit of an interest in the Chinese Communist government to kind of downplay this a little bit. I mean, we hear that the original virus coming out of Wuhan at first wasn't addressed immediately. We also hear that they were kind of downplaying the reports of how serious this was. So as a result, I see a lot of people kind of looking to the global reaction. We just saw in Hong Kong, the leader there is kind of limiting travel to their country. They're kind of all of a sudden closing different entrances and kind of taking this a little bit more seriously. So is that the way that we should be approaching this? Instead of taking China's word for it on all these issues, we should be looking at the global response?
Yeah, this is absolutely already reaching what the textbook definition of a pandemic is: an epidemic that takes place in multiple countries. Now, that already fits the textbook definition. There's no country in the world more globalized than China and America and parts of Europe. So they're everywhere. They have ties to everywhere. They have flights to everywhere. They have shipments to everywhere, certainly, right, made in China. So the idea that something that takes place in China is only going to affect China, yeah, maybe in the, up until the 1980s, the 1990s, but post-WTO, certainly China is everywhere. China is connected to everywhere. And so that's why myself and others very early on called for shutting down all transportation with China. We needed to end those flights already before the virus came over. Unfortunately, it already has. Now, of course, the president did just a few days ago announce that he was shutting down travel, that he was looking at creating different stoppages or quarantines for people who were coming back over, and I think that's a good position to take. But you also saw this response from the media that the United States was scaremongering or that it was xenophobic to take these drastic measures, and that it's really just only comparable with the flu, right? That was sort of a narrative that was out very early on. But it turns out that actually those of us that were calling for those extreme measures early on were the ones who were right.
Yeah, and you've been on top of this subject, as I said, since the beginning. So I'm sure we'll talk to you about this in the near future. Hopefully we have some good news on the horizon. But Jack Posobiec, thank you very much for joining us.